Good morning, everyone. This is Eric Bolesh from Cutting Edge Information, and we're actually excited to give this webinar today. We're doing a series of these over the course of the year and the months ahead, and in fact, we're going to be at a couple of events that you all might be at. Coming up in early April, those of you overseas especially will be in Amsterdam for the Global Transparency Reporting Congress. In mid-April, we'll be in Washington, D.C. for PCC, and then finally, at the end of April, we'll be at the FMV Congress up in Philadelphia. So we'll be making the rounds. If there's anything that you see or hear today that you'd like to talk about further and you know that you're going to be at one of those meetings, don't hesitate to come up to one of us. We'd be happy to talk about anything, really. It looks like the logins are starting to plateau, so I'm going to go ahead and jump into things here. Again, I'm Eric Bolesh. Thanks again for logging into today's webinar. We're going to be taking a look at healthcare provider travel compensation. I have a couple of housekeeping points at first. So before we jump into things, let me hit these key points. First of all, we are really excited. We actually have a partner on this webinar. We're working with University Conference Services to put everything on. They're an event organizer. They organize events like this one. They do live meetings, webinars, and so on. So we're really thrilled to be able to benefit from their expertise. Again, points on audio and video. Use that Q&A pane at the bottom of the screen to communicate with us. Nothing that you type there is going to be seen by the audience. So you can talk with us that way. If you have any questions, we are going to do our best to address them. And even if we don't have time for every single question today, we will follow up with you one-on-one. So we'll log everything, and then we will be able to get back to you. So there are no dumb questions. Anything you're curious about at all, we will follow up on with you. Lastly, you will get a PDF of our slides today in a follow-up email. So keep an eye out for that. We'll do a couple of points of follow-up, and that will be the first thing. Okay, let's jump in. So some quick introductions. Again, I'm Eric Bolesh. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here. That's me at the top. I'm joined by Jacob Presson, who is our Manager of FMB Services and Data Analytics. Jacob, why don't you say hi so everyone hears your voice?
Hi, everybody. I hope you're doing well, and like Eric said, really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Excited to walk through some of the data we've collected and hopefully hear from you guys as well to get some insights.
And you'll be hearing from Jacob a lot when it comes to presenting the actual data. We're going to turn things over to him, so get used to his dulcet tones. Now, both he and I have spent a lot of our time here at Cutting Edge Information developing research that delivers real-world findings to our clients. That's what we do. So let's take a look at today's agenda. I'll jump into some methodology slides. We'll move through that fairly quickly, and then we will get into the meat of our talk. We'll start internally. We're going to look at who's involved in developing travel policy. Then we'll jump into how companies approach airfare, lodging, food, some of these factors that affect travel policies. And then we will dive into a real trouble spot for some companies, which is basically answering how do you actually compensate thought leaders for their travel time? How do you pay doctors for time spent on the road from point A to point B? And we'll spend a good deal of time there. And then lastly, we'll address some other areas of concern, including local restrictions and post-travel acclimation time. So let's hit methodology. A little bit of background so you understand where this is coming from. We were founded almost 20 years ago, and in that time we've developed research and information products across a lot of different areas of life sciences. Now, we first started publishing research in the area of fair market value compensation, so FMV, more than 10 years ago when it was really starting to emerge as a topic of interest. And we've moved in that direction. So our focus now is solely on FMV and the topics connected to it. So we're looking at compliance topics related to physician engagement. Our flagship product, as many of you probably know, is an FMV rate database. We call it FMV Connect. We release it annually, and it covers nearly 300 different types of healthcare providers and non-medical personnel. across more than 130 markets, and it's broken down into tiers. So basically, it's a global rate database that allows our clients to build their FMV rates, and they license the data for the specialists in the markets that they need, and then develop and deploy their rates internally. Now, as we work with all of that FMV rate data, we get exposed to these connected areas of compliance and HCP relationship management, and that's why we're here this morning. So this year, we are publishing new research in several of these connected areas, and we're calling this package of research the Compliance Companion, because it really is a companion to all of our FMV rate data. Some of the information here in these topics that you see up on the screen, it comes from data that we're seeing every day, so we're collecting and looking at this information. Some of the other topics, we're doing additional new research, so we're going out and collecting information and then synthesizing findings and publishing it for all of you. And that's where travel policy comes in. So of course, that's what we're zeroing in on today. And what we did to build our data around travel policy is we went out and we developed a survey focused on this. In fact, over the last 5 years, we've conducted 3 different studies on travel policy. Each study used one of these surveys. The surveys queried all the topics that I talked about in the table of contents slide, things like travel time payments, classes of airfare and hotel, and so on. Now, in all, more than 120 different life science companies have contributed to this research. And on top of the survey data, because of the conversations we're having on a daily basis, we're able to layer interesting qualitative information, other content that we've gleaned from discussions with our clients as we address their FMV issues and their travel issues specifically. Okay, so let's jump right in. Here's our first topic. Internally, who does what when it comes to setting travel policy? What teams are involved? What impacts their decisions? Essentially, where do these policies come from? And to that end, it's time for our very first poll question of the day. You'll see a poll window popping up on your screen here. There you go. So we're interested in asking internally, if you'll pardon the pun, where does the rubber meet the road? Who is the primary decision maker for your company's travel policies? And if you could take a moment there, you can just select one. We know there are a lot of groups involved, but who actually has responsibility for setting the travel policy? And we're going to wait for these responses to come in. They're shifting a little bit in real time, as you can all see. And I'm actually going to start handing things over to Jacob here, so he can start to take us through the data, and he can respond in real time to what we're seeing on the screen. Jacob, what do you think?
So the first thing I'll say is that I'm actually quite pleased with how this has turned out. One of the things I'll touch on in a little bit is the importance of the cross-functional nature of what we talk about here today. It can never just be one team trying to tackle an issue as big as this. And so to see roughly 50% of folks who are taking this issue from a cross-functional perspective is really good. Compliance obviously is always going to be a key stakeholder, legal as well. For the folks who answered none of the above, if you don't mind popping just into the Q&A box and letting us know what other functions are involved that we didn't capture here, we'd love to hear about that. That's always something that we are keen on improving. But I think looking at, okay, I'm seeing a couple folks indicating finance, which definitely makes sense, and actually one of the first pieces of data we'll look at does show how cost actually does play a role for some of these organizations. So thanks so much for participating in that. I think we'll dive right into the presentation now. And so on the topic of the teams involved in setting travel policies, we wanted to provide an overview of how teams set these policies. And this chart shows the percentage of respondents split by team type that developed policies internally or through a third party or a combination of the two. Now, as you can see, regardless of group type, most policies are set entirely by internal teams. Now, I do have to say that almost half of the large companies that we surveyed do rely on some third-party assistance in developing these travel policies. And as an interesting note, geographically speaking, European teams are particularly reliant on the third parties. And we'll actually touch a little bit on why some of these European markets can be a little bit problematic when it comes to setting travel policy. Now, one thing that I will say is that there doesn't appear to be a connection between the approach described here and the specifics of the policy or the success.
Jacob, I'm going to jump in because someone in the Q&A pane is asking us to describe, or define rather, affiliate in this context, and that's a good question. Can you break down these two different categories that we have on screen?
Absolutely. So the company-wide indicates a team involved in setting global or company-wide policy, whereas at the affiliate level, that data was collected from teams operating at the business unit or country level. So slightly different perspectives from those setting those policies, but we wanted to make sure that we capture both of them.
And we did have one question just pop up about getting the slides after the call. and I do want to say yes, you will be getting via email a link to the slides, most likely coming in tomorrow. So you will get the content after the webinar.
And so now that we know kind of who is involved and how the policy is developed, I wanted to look at the factors influencing this travel policy. And so in this chart, we see the impact of various factors on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 indicating the greatest impact. And this is actually broken out by company size here. And so you'll see that the largest companies place the most emphasis on public perception, and they also appear to be the most aware of their position as the public face of the industry. Now, along those lines, cost appears to only be a major consideration for the largest companies. And in contrast, I want to highlight that for small and mid-sized companies, they are very reliant on the guardrails set by industry group standards and government regulations. So you do see the slightly different factors coming into how these policies are developed. And then I did want to take a step back and say, okay, now that you have a policy developed, over the past couple of years, we've asked companies how they feel about their travel policies relative to their compliance goals. Now, as you can see, just 9% of teams feel like their policies need improvement today, compared with 46% of teams surveyed in 2013. So obviously the good news here is that teams feel more comfortable with travel policies, and this really corresponds to teams setting and consistently applying travel policies in ways that they maybe didn't do 6 years ago. And this kind of ties back into that earlier poll question, where this policy needs to be cross-functional and include all stakeholders within the organization. And, you know, for some of the small companies who might be on the call today, that might be as simple as walking down the hall. But for those of you in larger organization, you'll need to be very strategic in laying out the benefits of a well-documented and consistently applied policy.
And there is a question coming in about whether data includes both pharma and medical device or medical technology companies.
And so unless otherwise specified, everything that we're talking about here today is going to be from the life science industry as a whole. You'll see that some slides are broken out a little bit where there might be a little bit of variation, but by and large, the data we're looking at is for the industry as a whole, and that's partially because we don't see a lot of difference in how these teams operate within the data, and so that's why we've decided to treat them all as a whole.
Great, and I do know that later on there are some slides that do break data out, including medical device as well, sitting alongside the different more traditional pharma buckets, so we'll see that as well. All right, thanks, Jacob. Okay, great. So as we're getting a sense of how policies are set, we're seeing increased alignment between these policies and compliance goals. Now, let's get into the actual travel component. Our next set of findings will look at air travel. Specifically, how is travel coordinated, so who's doing it, and then how do you choose a class for air travel.
And yeah, like Eric said, now that we have that overview, I wanted to look at a couple of the nitty-gritty details. And so what we'll see in this slide is the means by which companies arrange HCP travel. And so you'll see that the majority of companies use an external travel agency to arrange the travel. 25% of companies leverage an internal team. And I will say that most of the companies that have the KOL book their own travel are small, are the smaller size. They may not have the infrastructure. Now, there are many companies who utilize a combination of these booking arrangements, and a lot of times it seems like that comes down to the specific circumstances and also the resources that may be available at the affiliate level. Now, one of the things that comes up a lot with regards to these travel arrangements is when an HCP wants to extend the trip for personal reasons. And when we asked our partners in the industry, it seems like roughly 30% of those we surveyed don't allow this. But many do have a process in place that allows for it, and almost always, if this is allowed, the HCP has to pay for any difference, and in some cases, if it is allowed, the HCP actually has to take on a larger burden of the travel cost, again, just to avoid any appearance of impropriety. And just we're going to end up hammering this home a bit today, but accounting for these little scenarios is a really important aspect of travel policy and why it needs to be documented and communicated throughout the organization so that it can be consistently applied. Now, when it comes to booking airfare, we have a couple of rules of thumb, and they really break down between domestic and international travel, and I know for folks overseas, this might be better phrased as short-haul versus long-haul travel. And so for domestic or short-haul travel, we see that it's mostly in economy class, and by mostly I mean the vast majority, 96% of short-haul travel for HCPs is booked in economy class. And then when it comes to the international or long-haul travel, we see that around 70% of it is booked in business, just 30% booked in economy. And on top of this, there are two trends that I want to address. The first is that very rarely are different tiers of HCP booked on different classes of travel. In fact, we see very little tier differentiation within the industry today for most travel arrangements. The second thing I want to talk about is the near complete disappearance of first-class booking from travel arrangements. 5 years ago, it certainly wasn't a majority, but it wasn't unusual to see companies paying for first class on long-haul travel. We see almost no evidence for that today, and there's a couple of arguments for that. Obviously, business class travel over the past 10, 15 years is luxurious today to the point that it's almost first class. And additionally, there is that increased public scrutiny that we talked about on an earlier slide that does come in for a lot of organizations when they're setting these policies. So there's a lot of moving pieces for this.
And let me jump in here. This is a perfect time for our second poll question. And this one's focused on travel distance. And the question is, and it'll pop up on your screens here in a moment. There you go. What percentage of your total HCP engagements involve booking long-haul travel? And we are defining long-haul travel here as more than 6 hours. So it could be a long distance. It could also involve a couple of different legs. But what percentage of your HCP travel falls into these buckets? And so the results are coming in. Looks like they're coming in at the lower end, but you do have some that are significant distances. Wow. Yeah, what do you think, Jacob?
Yeah, so this is very interesting, and I'll be completely transparent here. A large part of why we asked this question is because this is genuinely something that we were curious about. As Eric mentioned, both of us have spent a lot of our career working in the industry, working in data, and we realized that we didn't really have a good sense of how this breaks down. And so it's interesting to see that, it looks like a majority of respondents for you less than 10% of your engagements involve long-haul travel. And so that's very interesting. And so certainly when we're talking about setting policy for long-haul travel, it might not affect a large percentage of your engagements, but as with all of these edge cases, whether it's extending a trip for personal use or anything like that, it's important to account for that. So I'll hand it back over to Eric.
And there is a question that's come in, and I'm not sure if we have the answer to this, but it's for domestic travel. It's a good point. The airlines don't always differentiate between business and first class. So do we have any point of clarification on that, going back to our survey methodology?
So, so we did basically ask for the equivalent of the class, and you're absolutely right. You don't really see much business and first class on domestic. You won't see both of those classes together on a domestic flight. And increasingly, and one of the things that we'll be looking at in the future is how companies are working with the new premium economy classes that are emerging that might, to an extent, be supplanting the old business class rows that you used to see. So definitely an area where we'll be looking to shape our future research, just to make sure that we're keeping up with not just the pharma industry, but the airline industry as well.
Lots of people to keep up with. That's right. And the important thing, to reiterate what Jacob said, is that we're seeing minimal differentiation among the tiers. So regardless of prestige or thought leader prominence, they're being booked into the same class of airfare. And so I would ask, does that standardization hold true for hotel lodging as well? And Jacob will dive into our findings here. We'll look at the class of hotels used for lodging, and we'll also look at meal arrangements, because it turns out that these doctors need to eat when they're on the road.
And like Eric said, in the answer to your question, Eric, is that we don't see a whole lot of tier differentiation for hotel lodging, just like travel. We'll get into a little bit of where that, some exceptions, but overall there isn't much tier differentiation. So when it comes to the class of hotel lodging, a small number of companies will book HCPs in 5-star hotels. The vast majority book HCPs in a 4-star hotel or their equivalent. And I will say that this appears to be standard across all regions that we surveyed. There's not a lot of variation there. And then finally, a small minority will use 3-star accommodations. Now, before I move on from this slide, I want to draw your attention to a trend that we see coming out of some countries in Europe, where there appear to be specific restrictions on both lodging and meal accommodations that may affect your ability to book an HCP in a 4-star hotel. And so again, this goes back, and I apologize for sounding like a broken record, but the importance of the cross-functional nature of setting a policy so that way you're bringing in all of the stakeholders who know what's happening on the ground, so that way your travel policy can be affected or influenced accordingly.
And Jacob, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a vertical element to that too as well, because you need feedback from your country operating units, your affiliates, to make sure that any policy you're setting is going to be sensitive to those local restrictions.
Absolutely, and so ideally it could be an iterative process. And so with regards to how we defined these, we actually the International Association of Hoteliers has kind of their definition of what falls into each star. And so, there is a little bit of ambiguity. Certainly some hotels will claim to be 5 stars when they're demonstrably not, but overall there does appear to be somewhat of a standard. Now, with regard to the differences in the industry sector, we do see that large pharma and mid-sized pharma are most likely to book all HCPs, regardless of tier, regardless of situation, into the same class of hotel. And that's in contrast to small pharma and medical device, who do actually have a tendency to adjust their hotel arrangements according to the specific circumstance.
There is a couple of questions that are coming in. I want to pause for a moment and see what we can address. One, this is a really excellent question. Where can you find all local and country laws on HCP travel? And this is a real cracker.
Yeah, and this is something that we've been trying to tackle both on the travel arrangement side as well as the F&B rates themselves, because we know that there are countries that are setting caps on those. And unfortunately, the answer right now is that there doesn't appear to be a centralized place in which companies can find all of these things. And so we do know that a lot of larger companies with significant on-the-ground operations, like Eric mentioned, that vertical element of making sure that you're talking to the teams on the ground, that's obviously going to be very important. We know that there are also some more legal-focused vendors who do go out there and will provide that information on the ground. But unfortunately, right now, there is not a centralized database that we know of that allows teams to quickly understand what's happening on the ground.
Yeah, and truth be told, we are in the process of trying to develop a solution for this. It's a huge issue, and the amount of information that it incorporates is vast. And it's not just local laws. You also have industry group guidelines. You have unwritten guidelines, general rules of thumb that may not even be documented anywhere. And so, again, it's a little bit of a half answer, but going back to the affiliate groups, ideally, if you have somebody on the ground there, we have found to be the most reliable way to make sure that any local compensation is following regulations or guidelines. But failing that, it becomes a quest for more information. It is something we're actively trying to do. I agree that it's a question that we need answered. Moving to a slightly different question, this should be a quicker answer. Jacob, what was the company you mentioned when you were talking about the hotel stars, the hoteliers?
Oh, I believe it's the International Association of Hoteliers. I don't know off the top of my head, but yeah, they kind of have their general guidelines for that. So hopefully that can be a good reference point for folks today. Now, with regards to meal allowances, we do see that the vast majority of these are set on a per meal basis. Just 10% of survey companies have a per diem for the HCPs with whom they engage, and then a small minority will have this set on a per trip basis. Now, obviously, regardless of how you structure the payment, there is a challenge of converting meal policies in different countries where purchasing power changes significantly. Obviously, a $30 US meal in the US will get you something very different in, say, Brazil or South Africa. I do know of one client who actually uses the Economist's Big Mac Index to kind of understand these differences in purchasing power and try to scale meal allowances accordingly. But it's an open challenge, but at the same time, there are definitely some creative solutions out there for folks looking to solve that question.
Great. Okay, so to sum up the research so far, we're seeing the industry largely moving toward uniformity in terms of class of airfare, class of lodging. Essentially, doctors are being treated the same. But what happens when it comes to paying for time actually spent on the road? How do companies approach this? So in this section, we're going to look at some rules of thumb for paying for travel time, and then we'll get into a system that we've seen some companies use to standardize how they're calculating hours actually spent in transit.
Thanks, Eric. And so this slide will actually show the percentage of companies within each sector of the life sciences industry that do pay HCPs for travel time. And overall, the industry seems to be trending towards doing so. Over 80% of large pharma, 50% of mid-sized, 71% of small pharma, and then 73% of medical device manufacturers paying for travel time. But I do want to make sure that we note that some companies will only pay for travel time on certain activity types. So when I say that they are paying for travel time, this isn't necessarily a blanket policy. Now, over the past 5 years, the industry has mostly settled on an approximate rule of thumb to to pay 50% of the hourly activity rate. So if the hourly activity rate is $300, then the travel time would be paid at $150 per hour. And I do want to show kind of how the industry is coalescing around that hourly rate. So when I look at the current lay of the land, I see that just 6% pay less than half the hourly rate, and actually 68% pay 50% of the hourly rate, like I mentioned, and we'll actually get into how they apply that momentarily. And then finally, 26% of companies pay more than half the hourly rate. And again, I have to note, very few will pay the full hourly rate for travel time. So there definitely is a clear understanding that with regards to travel time, if it is compensated, it's something to be treated separately and not paid at the same amount as the event itself. So again, kind of looking at how the industry breaks down, looking at the median percentage of the hourly rate that is paid for travel time, you see that the payment doesn't change significantly by company type. You'll obviously see the outlier there with small pharma paying a median of 75% of the hourly rate for travel time, but when I look at how that data has changed over the past 5 years, they appear to be coming towards the overall industry average of 50% of the hourly rate. Now, in terms of applying that 50% rule of thumb, we see a lot of teams use a system of bucketing to make the calculations easier. So, for example, one range of distance that takes about an hour to travel could be in its own bucket, and then each subsequent distance that an HCP travels as it gets further will get its own bucket. Now, here we show, cars and trains and planes, but really these bucket sizes are going to be dependent on the ranges of travel that your team typically encounters. And so, we had that poll earlier that talks about how for most of you, it's less than 10% of engagements that involve super long-haul travel. So you should scale your buckets accordingly to make sure.
And there is a question coming in about the geography covered by our survey data, and it's particularly relevant when we're looking at distance traveled. So the specific question is, does the statistic, the one we were looking at on the last slide, does it include countries in Asia? But I'll broaden that question. So what are the different geographic areas that are covered by the data we're presenting today?
Sure. So the majority of the data that we collected comes from the U.S. and European markets, but we do actually have, I would say around 10 or 15% of the data that we have comes from Asia, and then the remainder does come from other emerging markets such as Latin America, Middle East, and Africa as well. So we did try to capture the global landscape of the pharmaceutical industry. Now, so I wanted to show this bucketing system in action, and we have the following illustration that will hopefully show a set of 3 buckets that operate under the assumption of an hourly rate of $300. And so you have one bucket for 0 to 50 miles, another bucket for 51 to 100 miles, and finally one for more than 100 miles. Now, I do want to note that these numbers are just examples. They're not a policy recommendation from CEI, just something to show how this bucketing system might work. And we know, we already mentioned Asia, that some travel times will vary a lot depending on both region and infrastructure. So now that we have our hypothetical bucketing system in place, we can plug it into an example of an overall contract and see how it shakes out. So you see we have the preparation time, the travel distance of 150 miles, and then the speech itself. And what that does is that gives us a total of 1,950 for the engagement. And now, again, this is an example. Certainly different companies may have contracts that go beyond a single engagement. And so this is really a back-of-napkin approach, and it may not exactly meet your use case, but hopefully it's a useful illustration. Now, when it comes to actually taking all this information and tracking it for transparency reporting or whatever is required by your local regulatory environment, we see that many organizations are now implementing unified CRM systems that are able to combine inputs from both maybe an external travel agency, the contract itself for the event payment, and actually bring all of that together so that you're able to show the complete amount of the value transfer that occurs between the company and the HCP. And certainly as the HCP engagement systems become more complex, it seems like that's a rational direction to go, to have a sort of unified CRM system in place that can manage all of that.
And I do want to jump in here with our final poll question, but before I do that, there are a few questions that have come in. Going back to the geography question, Jacob, do you have a sense off the top of your head of what percentage of the sample comes from the U.S. and Europe?
I'd say about 50 to 55%.
50, okay, so about half. Okay, all right. There is a question about max hours paid by engagement, and we know that that's a system that we see in place, but I don't think this survey reflects the question around that topic.
No.
Okay. So it is something to be sensitive to, but the data we're presenting here, we didn't specifically ask about that. There are a couple other questions on, there is a question going back to the issue of the extended personal travel. Jacob, I don't know if you have anything else to add on that topic.
I mean, that's something that will really end up needing to be decided at the individual company level. You know, it seems like it's a rarity for this to come up, and it was interesting when we talk with folks. A lot of companies will have a policy where it is explicitly discouraged, but not actually completely disallowed. And so it might be one of those things where you kind of have, if that request comes in, you have an initial response that says, no, we don't do that, but then you still have a fallback policy in place just in case it's something that that ends up happening. And so I think we have a poll question coming up.
Question. Let's pull up this last poll question here. And this gets into this travel distance question. What's the minimum distance for which you will compensate an HCP for their travel time? So what is the threshold? And this feeds into, obviously, these travel or the interval schemes that companies have set up because there are minimum distances within which travel is not compensated. And all right, it looks like a lot of none of the above. And then we do have some minimum thresholds there. Yeah, so I would, again, in the Q&A pane, for those who are indicating none of the above, does that mean that there is no threshold, that you are approaching it in a different way entirely? Is it time-based? Oh, there we go. So yeah, people are saying it might be time-based instead. So if you are basing your travel by number of hours traveled, it's not going to be distance-based. And then other people saying that it's not, they may not be compensating for travel in all cases, so it becomes difficult. There's a question in here actually about whether our data here covers different types of transportation. So the eponymous, the planes, trains, and automobiles.
Absolutely, and so, you know, certainly anytime we're talking about travel time, that would cover travel by any medium. Whether, you know, we have one person mention, you know, if they drive down the road a mile or two, then that constitutes travel, and so certainly all of that would be covered under the travel time and bucket. And the other interesting thing that we're seeing is that there is no minimum threshold, and so that's definitely something that we'll look to expand upon in future research. So thanks everybody for participating in that.
Okay, so we're moving into our very last section here. Again, we spent a lot of time on travel compensation itself, but there are a couple of other factors that we want to be sure to address before we wrap up today. Jacob is going to take us through the issue of local restrictions, which we touched on a little bit and remains a can of worms, and also how companies approach acclimation time.
And so with regards to some of these restrictive hotspots, we did want to take a moment to identify some of the additional considerations. I did mention earlier that in Europe, some countries are setting specific restrictions on travel arrangements for HCPs, and these are specifically around hotel lodging and food. And additionally, when looking at the comments in response to the travel time question, there do seem to also be restrictions on paying for travel time at all. And so, you know, and this is something that we've already mentioned, but it's really important to engage with teams on the ground, or if you don't have that available to you, local vendors who specialize in this topic, because unfortunately, you know, like we mentioned earlier, there isn't really a centralized database of these regulations, and that's partially because they are constantly changing and to an extent can be difficult to keep up with, and additionally, some of them are somewhat informal. They may be as a part of a industry organization, and so those can present a unique challenge to try and track. Now, with regards to acclimation time, which is something that comes up a lot, this idea of potentially compensating an HCP for time to recover at the location of an event if they've traveled a long distance. And unfortunately, unlike travel time, there is no industry consensus. So 33% of companies explicitly forbid the compensation of acclimation time, while in contrast, we have 36% of companies allow for it. In some cases, even for domestic travel, and specifically, you could see why this might happen in the U.S., where even domestic travel might cross 3 time zones and take a full day of somewhat exhausting travel. And then in the meantime, 26% of those we surveyed don't yet have a policy. So there's a lot of uncertainty here. And I think you'll see the relationship between companies who, regardless of what side of the fence you fall on, it's important to have a set policy that you can consistently follow and consistently apply. Now, when companies are looking at paying for acclimation time, there's a couple of factors that they'll look at. So both Europe and Asia Pacific mostly look at the distance and duration of travel, but when we surveyed our partners in the U.S., they will also look at the number of time zones crossed as well as the number of legs. And again, this has a little bit to do with our unique travel situation in the U.S., where you might have to connect through a couple of different hubs to get where you're going, and may involve several legs of travel. So that's all that I have for you, so I'll hand things back over to Eric.
Great. Thanks, Jacob. Okay. That brings us to the end of our slides for the day, and we are going to get into addressing some of the questions that have been coming in. But first, a couple of final points. One, on the left side of the slide up here, our plans for 2019. We have some big plans. First and foremost is that our new FMV hourly rate data will be launching in the beginning of April. And that's obviously a big deal, and we're looking forward to that. And then after that, we'll be publishing research around all of these different component points of the Compliance Companion. And we have webinars planned for these as well. Excuse me. The next one, we're going to be focusing on rate cards, and that will be in May. Again, I mentioned this at the top of the session, but we will be at a number of different events coming up. In April alone, early April, we'll be in Amsterdam at the Global Transparency Reporting Congress. Mid-April, we'll be at PCC in Washington, D.C., and then at the end of April, we'll be in Philadelphia at FMV Congress. And in our session there, actually, we'll be talking about travel again. But if you encounter us or any of our colleagues at any of these meetings, please bring up any questions. We'd love to meet you out and about in the world. On the right side of the slide, here's some contact information for me and for Jacob, so please do reach out to us. I know many of you in the audience today have a direct conduit to your account or relationship manager, so however you can bring questions to us or points of feedback or issues that you're dealing with, we welcome any and all communication. Okay, that's out of the way. Let's get into some of these questions. there was one question about compensating for back-to-back events. So I don't know if we have it in the data, but maybe anecdotally, Jacob, you can speak to how companies handle back-to-back events and compensation there.
This is a question that we did touch on somewhat briefly in the survey, and it doesn't seem like most companies have a clear policy for this. And it seems to fall under the same category of extending a trip for personal reasons, and that a lot of times companies might default to managing it on a case-by-case basis, especially if you feel like it doesn't come up very often. So we don't have a lot of specific data on that one.
Okay. Yeah, and folks, if you do have any other questions, please feel free to ask them now. We will get to as many of them as we can. Again, we'll follow up with you one-on-one if we aren't able to answer the question in the session today. And here's one coming in. Do we have any comment related to government-employed KOLs, such as NIH staff or others?
So I don't have anything specific to travel compensation for those kinds of employees. I do know that a lot of what we're seeing is that companies, and in fact this is in reaction to local regulations, where they need to get employer or administrator sign off before the engagement. And so I know that that's not specific to the travel component, but there are definitely some complications within that regulatory environment.
And there's another question here specifically around tiering and how companies are establishing their KOL tiers, and the questioner is specifying not necessarily specific to travel, but generally, and it obviously has an impact on the travel itself.
So with regards to tiering, I mean, certainly we see a lot of tier differentiation or tiers being defined, rather, by the amount of experience that a physician has, as well as, and by that I mean clinical experience. And in addition, they might be interested in the experience the clinician has in certain settings. So how many speeches have they given? Do they have experience with clinical trials? That may in fact play a role in their tier determination, and in fact is increasingly, or is quite common when deciding how much to pay.
There is a question going back to the planes, trains, and automobiles, and it's, do some companies limit their travel compensation based on the time to plane and train travel, which is easier to calculate than auto travel?
Absolutely. And we actually saw this in one of the comments there, that to an extent it might be easier to reimburse just mileage for car travel and then restrict the travel time compensation for air travel, train, or some other, prearranged mode of travel.
Okay. With those distance intervals, how do you choose how many different buckets of distances that you have?
So we actually asked about this in the survey, and the reason it didn't end up in the presentation is that there wasn't really a clear answer. It seems to very much depend on how your company is structured, and again, making sure that you're covering the types of travel that you typically encounter. So there's no point in having 10 buckets if you never use 5 of them. I will say that the average seems to fall around 4 or 5 buckets. That seems to be what's manageable for a lot of these teams, but I don't think I would interpret that as a rule of thumb to necessarily follow. It really is going to depend on the travel distances or durations that you encounter daily.
Yeah, and I know that we're comfortable saying that some things are industry standard. Going back to the Airfare class, for example, one particular approach for domestic, one particular approach for international, no differentiation by tier. We're seeing enough data to say, all right, here's how the industry is doing it. This is one of those areas that, frankly, it's developing, and different companies are doing it in different ways. And I know that in our conversations with some clients, maybe they started out with a certain number of buckets and then realized that all of their HCP travel was within a certain range, so they adjusted their buckets downward, say, to account for that. And then on the other end, a company may only have 2 or 3 buckets and realize that it's not working for them, so they will adjust upward to 4 or 5. So it's not set in stone, there's nothing saying that you can't change these systems, obviously, once they're in place and once you see how they're working on the ground. Question about patients. Do we have any information for compensation of travel time for patients? We do have patient data. Do we have travel data?
We don't have anything specific right now. We don't see any reason to treat them differently. And again, you do want to make sure that there is consistency in how your policies are being applied. But right now, we don't have any data specific to them, but we also don't see any reason for them to be a special class of engagement per se.
Okay, and we do have FMB rate data for patients, a couple of different categories of patients in our FMB database. So would you be using those data points and then applying your system, then okay, so if your hourly rate is X, you may be going 50% of X, and it just happens to be for the patient as opposed to a cardiologist or what have you. Okay, great. How do we manage cross-border engagements, or can we speak to cross-border engagements? So this is a big topic.
It's interesting because when we talk to folks either through the survey or directly, the general approach seems to be to apply the most restrictive policy. So let's say if you are in one country that allows for travel time compensation, and the HCP is from a country that does not allow for that compensation, you follow the most restrictive regulation and you don't pay for travel time. So that seems to be where the industry is heading. But even with that said, there are some companies who will say, we follow the rules of the home country. And so if the event is taking place in Germany, anybody who's participating in that event will follow the rules and policies that apply to the German team.
There's another question here. Do the majority of companies use these travel buckets as opposed to paying actual travel hours? So a heuristic or a scheme versus actual travel hours?
There's not a clear trend yet. We see a lot of companies and to be honest, this is anecdotal. This isn't based on my review of the data, but it does feel like a lot of the smaller companies will prefer to just look at the number of hours traveled and pay that. Larger companies like to have a sort of structured rubric for how to manage this, but I wouldn't say that that's necessarily a firm trend.
Okay. How about thought leaders with specific medical needs?
Yeah, and so this is something that does come up, and the way that I see most folks treating it is a lot of times if you pay hourly rates to a physician, you have an exceptions process in case you encounter a physician who is otherwise Tier 3, but maybe has a unique set of qualifications that would constitute a higher rate. And so most companies have an exceptions process in place to pay a higher level of compensation. And in the same way, you might have an exceptions process for travel arrangements where you say, okay, in order to book a business class seat on a domestic flight, this person from compliance, we need to have their sign off in order to do it. And it can be as simple as that. You don't need to make it more complicated than it has to be, but it is important that when you encounter these situations that there is a standard process that's being consistently applied so that you could process that exception and hopefully take as good a care of these HCPs as you can.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions here. And Jacob, I suspect that your answer on exceptions processes or having just a framework in place may apply to this question as well. But it's a good one. How are lengthy delays addressed? It's not uncommon to get delayed overnight, to require extra lodging, and so on.
So we don't have any data specific to managing these delays, although, I will say that a lot of, if it's not caused by the airline, then then it might be incumbent upon the HCP or your organization to cover that cost. But I would certainly want to make sure that if you do encounter that scenario where it is paid out, that it's fully documented. And the other thing I will add is that this might be a reason why a lot of companies go through third-party travel agencies, because those third-party agencies are pretty uniquely equipped to handle somebody whose travel they've arranged who is stuck in Vancouver overnight. And that might not be something that your organization is equipped to do internally, and so I'm sure that that's part of the appeal of arranging travel through a third-party agency.
Okay. Before I do move on to these last few questions, I know we're coming up to the top of the hour, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I will say that there will be speaker evaluation or session evaluation surveys that will pop up, and we ask that all of you take the time to fill that out. We really appreciate your feedback, and we use it. So we appreciate everything you have to say. Now, for these last couple of questions. Jacob, is there any data on how companies decide when they can provide travel-related expenses to HCPs? So, for example, might a company base that decision on distance or the time to travel from an HCP's base city versus the venue of the event or some other factor?
I think if you're talking about reimbursing them for travel costs, I don't know if there's necessarily a minimum. I think it would be perfectly reasonable, even if you're just asking the HCP to drive an hour from one city to the next one, it would be perfectly reasonable to have some sort of mileage compensation in there. And I think that would be within the industry norm, at least here in the U.S.,
okay.
Where travel by vehicle is quite common.
All right, and we'll do one more question before those evaluations will pop up. Again, if you've asked a question that we haven't addressed here, we will get back to you directly, so don't fret about that. The question is, do we have any data on the contracting practices that companies use with HCP? So what do we know about contracting?
So, it seems to fall under a couple of different umbrellas. You will see in some cases per event contracting where, like that little example that we put together, you write up a contract for a single event, you negotiate the rates, the compensation for travel time. A lot of times that contract won't include the travel costs themselves, especially if you have a third party. A third-party travel vendor, then you might defer those arrangements to them, but then you have a contract specific to the event. We also see a lot of our larger clients set up annual contracts that kind of basically define the rate at which they and the HCP have agreed to an engagement, and then under the terms of that contract, they will have individual engagements, whether it's a consulting engagement or they do a speech on behalf of the company, and so there's no set in stone approach to structuring these contracts as of yet.
Okay, great. Well, we're going to close off the questions there. I want to thank everybody for attending today. There's terrific engagement on this topic. I know no one can see anybody else, but there have been a lot of questions and a lot of folks in the audience with really good points. Thanks again. Thanks to Jacob. Thanks to University Conference Services for helping us out with this. We're going to close out the session, and then your questionnaire, your feedback questionnaire will pop up. Thanks again to everybody, and have a terrific day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.